It's not often that I read something written by a sales agent that has me spitting out my tea, thumping the table and saying, hell yeah. Normally I'm annoyed at sales speak, the unconscious bias and a lack of nuance. But property isn't all about bricks and mortar, it's about people. And who better than a selling agent to make observations about the often absurd way in which buyers and sellers respond to different market conditions. Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, recently ranked number 5 in Australia out of over 18,000 brokers in the annual MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of an appropriate and experienced professional.
Today we're joined by Sydney real estate agent David Murphy, who has come to our attention not through his record-breaking sales nor via pithy Insta reels, but through some old-fashioned wordsmithing in weekly emails that cut through the crap. No other agent has had their emails shared around my team with the same frequency. A genuine career agent, David Murphy started in real estate at the tender age of 19 and he set up his own business in 2007 with the goal of being the leading independent agency in Mossman. And David's weekly emails provide a humorous yet sharp perspective on what's going on in his market, and it usually boils down to some predictable yet rarely acknowledged human behaviour. For example, in one December 2022 email, he refers to the slowdown of the market, and I quote, "Low activity isn't a bad thing. It means no one is panicking, but it's frustrating. The mathematical formula is unrealistic sellers plus cautious buyers equals real estate agents curse and drink more wine." Well, welcome, David. We're looking forward to a conversation about what goes on at ground level in the property market.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on the show.
David, it's a really, refreshing. What people really want from agents is that, truth and honesty and real matter of fact, I find. So obviously some people want the opposite, right? They want you to tell how amazing their property is. But, has this been your approach since day one, back when you were 19? Or have you sort of grown to be this more matter of fact and frank about the way that you approach things?
Look, I think it's a bit of both. When I came into real estate, which was now nearly 25 years ago, on my first day, the people that I started working with had me as a dummy bidder at an auction, and I was 19 and it was day one in real estate. And I was thinking, how on earth, how does this work? And I think I started to develop a bit of a sense of when I walked into people's living rooms pitching for business, that if we just called it the way that it was, that most people really, really responded well. The newsletter, it started as an internal memo that I used to just send out to the staff as a bit of a joke, and we'd have a crack at local competitors. And then a few years ago, my office manager said, we really need to get this out there. And we were really surprised at the level of engagement. We do get complaints. I think a lot of agents subscribed in our database, not as agents, but they really let us have it. But what we find, honestly, is that there's a real hunger out there for people just to kind of hear it the way it is. And real estate's got so much spin that I think, like Chris, I read some of your posts on LinkedIn and I notice it's authentic and people engage with it because it's honest. People don't want to hear about the red hot market when the auction clearance rate is at 55%. So it's been a really interesting journey. The newsletter's turned into a bit of a car that I don't know how to drive because we've now got over 20,000 subscribers, and there's pressure every week to come up with something funny. But we literally have a think tank on a Friday morning and say, what are we seeing out there, and talk about it, and most of the time sort of hit the mark.
It's so funny because it's like, I often think you could write a comedy script about, I guess there is that what's that thing set in Tasmania called, but that's not quite the same. A proper comedy script about all the things that happen in a real estate agency and all the silly things that people say and all the dialogue that gets said. You talk about spin and as you're talking, I keep thinking about the way, and look, I'm guilty. I've been a sales agent as well. It's like you talk about a growth corridor and you're really talking about development. You're not talking about capital growth. Yeah. You're talking about spring is seller's market. No, it isn't. It's buyer's market. It's just, spring has sprung. It's a selling season. It's actually, there's nothing in that for vendors, really. It's good to hear, actually, that you've had that level of response.
Yeah.
to your emails. 20,000 subscribers, huge.
Yeah.
Do you say that? So I'm guessing then, because I was going to ask, do you say the same things in your listing appraisals? But it sounds like the newsletter has sort of evolved from what you've been doing as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, that's true. I think that we kind of knew we were onto something when after the GFC, when I'd started the business, that we were getting called in and we weren't being pitched against other agents. We were just being called in for discussions, and people actually just cared about what we said. We don't win all of the listings and the business that we pitch for, but we are often called in to have just a meaningful, sort of valuable discussion. So the newsletter, as silly as it is sometimes, I think really is just a response to, I go into living rooms all the times and I hear what some of the other agents say to people, and it's just, there's such a disconnect between the profession and consumers. I often say to team members here when I'm training them, don't try and be one of these superstars. Just be yourself. Like, just sit down with people and be honest, and you'd be amazed at the response you get. But if you think about it yourself, if you call in 3 agents and 2 of them are there with a pen trying to force you to sign something, and someone else is there trying to figure out what you're trying to achieve, should you be selling? Is this the right time? You're going to win the business, or you're going to win the client, and that's not hard work. It's actually easier.
What do you think, David, the BS test? We had a vendor advocate on we haven't done just recently, and she was sort of, whole business around vendor advocacy in Melbourne, and I was kind of like, she's a BS test sort of thing. She can sort of hear what the agent's saying, and no, that's just agent talk, right? They're talking nonsense, and this is a strategy you might want to, for that type of, the typical sort of over, buying the listing. For people who are thinking about selling, how do you really how can you identify that type of agent very early on? What's some of the questions you'd probably ask if you were selling, and and what's some of the things that you would want to know, that you're picking the right agent?
It's a really good question, because I think most of the problems come about when people call in 3 trained, charming salespeople into their living room and then try and choose which one is the most charming.
Or the least smarmy.
Exactly. Actually, it's funny you say that. There was a research thing done about 10 years ago, and I think the results of it were that the majority of people chose the real estate agent they disliked the least, which I found quite tragic. But I think the whole quote trap where people get called in, or agents get called in and ask, how much is my house worth? Normally the issue, and I don't want to sound like I'm standing in front of agents, but I do know what it's like when you really want to win a listing, and you know that if you tell the truth, you're not going to win the listing because the other guys are going to be in there talking higher numbers. But I do think that as a seller, you can find ways to sort of debunk what the agent's really thinking. And I think things like sliding scales on fee are very revealing. I think if you say to an agent, look, it's great that you think my house is worth 3 million. Everyone else thinks it's worth 2.5. I want 3. So if you can get me 3, I'm happy to pay you 2.5%, where an average fee might be, say, 2%. But then if you say to the agent, would you be interested in a tiered payment schedule or a sliding scale? And they say, yeah, absolutely. It's always very telling if you tell the agent to design that scale and present it to you, because in that scale, it'll tell you what the agent thinks your house is worth. Now, it happens to me all the time. The problem with the newsletter is I get people that call in and read it and go, all right, mate, well, you're still a real estate agent, and I have to do that. But it is a very good sort of way to tell. I see the agent really thinks it's worth about 2.7, not 3. I think that's a good start.
I love that, because the problem is that everyone plays a part in this,
Totally.
right? The owner is being flattered. And I remember I was a sales agent. I know I've had friends list properties. We do vendor advisory work as well. Yeah. I get the pull to go with that person who, and inverted commas, believes in my property. I mean,
totally. It's irresistible. Look, I sold my house last year, and I said to a colleague, get some people through it, and if they offer me this, I'll give them the keys. And one of my colleagues, Bindi, brought a bunch of people through. The third person that came through offered me that number. And I was like, get another 100,000. And she was like, you're doing what we see all the time. And of course, she didn't get it. We sold the house and it all worked out well. But I think it's very hard when you're trying to value your own home and your future. Like if if I sit in front of you and say I can get you 3 million, you do want to believe it. And that's where it gets tricky. And I do empathize with sellers a lot where they go, look, David, we trust you. We feel like you're being completely straight with us, but if the other guy can get us that because he believes in it, that is a tricky space to sort of to pull apart.
What's your thoughts, David, around the things that are wrong with the property, the compromise that buyers are ultimately going to make, right? In a hot market, buyers make lots of compromises, right? The compromise is, if I don't buy now, I'll never buy, sort of in their mindset, right? So in this market, though, everything's telling, right? The veil's been lifted, the stairs, the road, the noise, the privacy, etc. How do you sort of approach that? Like, let's say the property's sellable. I guess every agent thinks every property's sellable at a certain price, but how do you deal with those up front rather than, later on in the campaign when, we're not selling it for what you said because people aren't, we knew that at the start that people weren't going to like that. So why are you bringing my price down now? So how do you deal with things that are wrong with the property from a buyer's point of view, with the seller?
That's another good question. I think it's very difficult to call someone in. It's that whole, like, do I look good in this dress thing, right? You can't win no matter which way you go with it. I will say this year that we've won a lot of the sales that we've won. We've actually been the second agent, because we've sat in front of people and said, it's not worth that because the stairs. I mean, the point you make is a very good one. We're in a far more discerning market now, and there's that saying that when desperation rises, standards fall, and we're in a market now where people will walk away and go, it doesn't have a fence down the southern boundary, and you think, well, I can get you a fence, for 10 grand. But I think the way that I try to deal with it is to talk to people, explain that being objective when they're selling their property actually adds value to the process, because real estate's full of so many paradoxical moments where, like, when your house goes on the market first, you'll generally get your best offers. But when your house has gone on the market first, you've just been through 2.5 months of decluttering, getting in stylists. You don't want to give it up on the first week. You kind of want to see who else is out there. But I think if a seller can enter the market with an agent that they know is being honest enough with them when they're looking to hire, that they're probably going to be hiring someone that when they're on the market is going to be able to guide them through the process. And look, trust, it's so schmarmy to sit in front of someone as an agent and say, look, it's really important that you trust your agent. But I've got clients I've worked for now 3 or 4 times, and they call me up and say, we want to move in March. What do you think? The market's the market. We all know that. If you get lucky, you could get an amazing price. But I think you do need to understand the shortfalls of your property before it goes on the market, because if you waste time on market or on stage, as I often say to clients, downloading negative feedback, it can cost you in the end. So look, it's not easy. It's not easy to have a mortgage and sit in front of someone and think, if I fumble the ball here, I'm going to lose an $80,000 fee. And, the guy down the road at X, Y, and Z real estate is going to win the listing. But it's a bit of a leap of faith. And I think that most people are, or I'm lucky in the area that I work in, pretty switched on, pretty commercial, and they recognize it and they can smell the BS when it's in front of them. But look, even this morning, my assistant said to me, we didn't get that one in Neutral Bay, and it's a $3 million property, and I know it'll sell for what we think it'll sell for. In fact, can I tell you a
But that doesn't pay you though, right? So that doesn't get you paid, and that must be the hard thing from an agent. You sort of miss out on it. Someone's overquoted it. They're going to get the sale for a price that you've told the person selling it will go, oh, David told me it was going to sell for 2.75. But the commission has gone to the agent that overquoted it. That must, as an agent's being honest out there, is that sort of, how do you deal with that?
Well, you often get them next time round, like 6 or 7 years down the track. It's interesting. I was just thinking about something. I went to a realestate.com think tank a couple of years ago, and they said to me and a bunch of agents, how do we make this website more consumer friendly? And I sort of put my hand up, being a bit naive, and said, why don't you track the agents with what they quote on day one for the property's worth, and then form a ratio or some sort of indicator that, Veronica's 90% accurate or David's 85% accurate. And the room erupted. Like, all the agents were like, oh, there's no way we'd do that. But I mean, how good would that be if you were looking online and you could sort of tell? So look, the price issue is tricky.
I love that the room erupted. No way we're going to do that. I mean, I've sat in some real estate briefings as well. You know, I've been around 20 odd years, and I remember one about underquoting. It was bringing in the new underquoting laws. I think it was back in 2016, and it just like people were tripping over themselves to ask questions like, "How can we get around it? How can we get around it?" You know.
Do you know what? I'll say one thing about that. I've been thinking about that a lot recently, because recently we got the microscope put on us by Fair Trading, because the prices have fallen. So
yes,
our price guides have changed, and there's been a couple of occasions where the property has looked like it's being underquoted, but it's not. We just don't have any interest in the house. But I think that when buyers start their buying journey, they have an unrealistic picture of what they can buy. And when sellers start their selling journey, they generally have an unrealistic picture of what they'll get. And agents live in that space in between. And thank God, because if people weren't unrealistic, there'd probably be transactions, made left, right, and center where people would just be like, yeah, okay, I'll take that. That's a fair price, where agents have to manage it. So it's tricky. Like, having just bought and sold, I paid more than I wanted to. I didn't get that extra $100,000. Objectively, we did all right,
It's funny. It's funny you say that, because it's one of my issues with a lot of these, these real estate, the new prop tech solutions that supposedly deal with this lack of trust in the industry. And it's what they've failed to understand is, just because an AVM says a property's worth something does not mean the vendor's going to accept that, and does not mean the buyer's going to pay that. And that's really where the role of a good agent comes in. But I've noticed quite a lot what happens in a market that turns down. So I've definitely noticed this at sort of the beginning of COVID, and I certainly noticed this in second half of 2022. You get agents who use fear to encourage vendors to list now, because obviously it's in an agent's best interest to you list now. It's not in my best interest as a sales agent to say, "Oh, wait till next year. I think that, there'll be less stock in the market, or will be better conditions," or whatever. And so you hear this peddling, and I'm quite surprised, even from agents that I've respected, that really pushing this idea that next year the market's going to fall off a cliff and all this sort of stuff. What do you think? What goes through your minds when you hear that sort of dialogue from sales agents to potential vendors?
We're hearing that, like, a huge increase in that. In fact, I saw a property the other day, and I think the auction's about 4 days before Christmas Day. And when I spoke to the owners, they rang me and said, "Do you think it's too deep into the Christmas season?" I'm like, it's 3 or 4 days before Christmas. It's pretty deep in the Christmas season.
Hell yeah.
I think that the issue here is that it's been a leaner year for real estate agents. I know our sales figures are down sort of 20 to 25% on last year. So I think there are a lot of agents that have had a pretty tough year. I'm not asking for everyone to sort of feel terribly sorry for them, but I think that is a driving factor for why agents, it's very competitive at the moment. Every year when the December media cycle starts, I always hear this: next year is going to be the year. It's like the media just turns towards a very speculative stage about what next year may or may not be. Every year, Q1 of the new year, I've seen, and I might be wrong because of the rates and there's all these other factors, but I've seen the market actually come back with a little bit more life and outperform Q4 of the year before. So I'm not an economist. I often say to clients, I can't predict what will happen, but I think of an agent sitting in front of you right now saying there's still time for an auction campaign this year. It makes no sense to me to step into this market. The market's exhausted. It's been a long year, and I think with all of the rate rises, you're dealing with a very. I hope you agree with that, Chris. Like, I do read your articles, and I like the fact that they're data driven and direct. But what we're seeing is a market that needs a reset, needs a break. I just think that consumers, to answer your question, Veronica, I think that consumers just need to be aware of, if an agent's coming into your house pushing for a listing and a sale, they're looking for a commission. If they're not talking options, they're looking for a commission. I've been there. I mean, I've got the luxury of age now where I'm, in my 40s, and I've had a fairly good career. So it does come with time that you can afford to sit in front of someone and say, listen, maybe you should wait. I think back when I was 22, 23, sitting in living rooms going, no, the market's going to crash next year. There's the bird flu. There's like all these different
something.
things. Yeah, the Y2K, the bird flu. There's like, there's always something. But I think based purely on supply and demand, I'm very bullish medium to long term of property in Sydney, and I think if people are in no need to sell, it's a buyer's market at the moment. There's no need to entertain it.
I mean, that sort of age, you'd have to think you're a pretty good actor though, right? Because, one minute you walk in, you're sitting in the lounge room, right? And you're like, market's going to collapse, right? Next minute you leave the front door, jump in your car, and go to an open home. And now you got to be like, oh, what a great time to buy, And so you'd have to be like almost bipolar in a sense to be able to play both of those things realistically. And that's, I think, from a long term point of view, they're the agents that are going to crash and burn because they're going to get it wrong. It's the same in financial planning world. I was reading the wrong things early days, being an advisor, reading the wrong newsletters, going to the wrong events, etc. And you think that, marketing shows that financial advisors can outperform markets. That's what we were told. That's what the whole sales industry is. Then you realize after a few years, hang on a sec, I've made it wrong 3 or 4 times. These index funds just outperform, and you get those learnings. But that abundance mindset, I think, will carry you through long term. So where Veronica said, it's not in their interest. Well, it is actually in your interest to be frank and play the long game. It's the only way you're going to survive. And you're only get better results. I think the North Shore mindset, though, every community's got different people, right? Different cats, I guess. The North Shore sort of mindset is such a long-term generational wealth. What are some of the things that people who don't know that marketplace that really perpetuate it and sort of give it sort of stability, parents and the kids reinvesting, and how does that all sort of play out that people just don't understand the power of, established markets to hold their value versus, say, new markets where people are much more flippant?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that the main thing is established wealth. Because I think when the market changes, what I've noticed, for listeners that don't know, I'm based in sort of Mosman, Cremorne, Neutral Bay, very lucky in that space because it is a very affluent area. But when the market changes significantly, locals buy the property. Like if someone lives on Spencer Road in Mosman and all of a sudden a semi that used to be 2.4 million is now 1.9, somebody who's been on the street for 30 or 40 years will have the equity to buy that because they know that in 2-3 years time it'll be back. I've got this theory that, like, after a couple of glasses of wine, that Australia being relatively newly settled, we've got a blind faith in settlement and in property, and that underpins the market. I think at the end of the day, we all believe that if you've got a decent house on a decent street over time, it'll go up. And it's a fair call to think that, because if you look historically, the numbers sort of support it. But I think areas like the lower North Shore of Sydney, there's hardly any new property being built. There's pressure there from locals, from people returning from overseas. There's always a market. Even now, when I talk about it being a buyer's market, we're only playing 15% off the highs of last year. It's not a bad market. It's just not quite what it was. So the observation that I've made around here over the years is because it's quality property, people know, or they collectively believe that medium to long term wise that the property will keep going up in value. And in a sense, that creates a false bottom in the market that everyone on the street goes, I wouldn't sell at the moment. There's no way I'd take 2 million for this place. So I feel like there's that self-sourcing element, but it's true. There's only a limited number of houses. We're in a beautiful city in a beautiful country in a great part of the world, and a lot of people want to live here. So,
that's sort of the definition of market value, isn't it? A willing seller meets a willing buyer, and of course, if you've got unwilling sellers, they don't need to meet the market. Then of course, that's why you've got that flaw. Yeah. It is interesting though, because I remember being a sales agent. I remember you still got to deal with sort of know-it-alls that turn up to your open houses and trying to tell you it's all going to fall through the floor. It could be wishful thinking because they're not in the market themselves.
People that didn't buy before 2016.
There's always that person who'll never get in the market because it's never good enough for them. But what are some of what frustrates you the most about buyer behaviour and some of those lines that they'll trot out and they don't realise that they're not the only person to have said that?
Yeah, look, I think buyers have had a bit of a comeback this year. They've sort of been treated badly for the last 2 years and sort of, humiliated at auctions. I know my sister-in-law went through 6 months of turning up and attending auctions on the northern beaches and just getting absolutely, it was actually
Hammered.
terrible because she was going through a lot. But I think buyers have come back in this market in 2022 with a bit of revenge up their sleeve and turning up to auctions. And we had an auction 2 weeks ago, in fact, where we had 3 registered buyers and 3 other buyers that didn't register, but they just heckled the auction because it didn't get to reserve. And, they loved it. And I was kind of standing there thinking, how much time do you have on your hands if you're doing this on a Saturday morning? But
Yes.
I think what buyers need to sort of be mindful of is, particularly if it's for a home, you don't win by going in and being difficult with the agent. I know a lot of agents are difficult to deal with, and having just been through it, I totally empathise with that. But if the agent that you don't like or have been pretty tricky with lists the house that you do like, you're in a really tricky position, because it scares me sometimes how much power agents have in the process, because they're the conduit between the market and the vendor. And what I see sometimes at open houses is buyers come in, be openly critical of a property, talk the price down, and sort of walk out the door like they have just won the day, and then a week later that agent's got the house they want and they put themselves into a tricky spot. But again, I understand it, because I think if you look at underquoting and people literally, like I bought a house last year, and the price guide was 22% below what we had to pay to buy it. Now, we knew it was under, but my partner at the time, she was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe we can afford this property." And I'm like, "We can't. Like, we're getting played." But then I got into a bidding war, and she was so invested in buying the house that I was in this it was a good learning, because I was like, "Oh gosh, like now we have to buy it." And for people that miss out at auctions, it always makes me think, when you look at an auction, there's always that celebration for the person that wins, but there's normally 2 or 3 people left in the garden that are gutted.
Yeah.
It's a really difficult a difficult thing to deal with. So I think, look, what I see a lot of is buyers now coming back being like, "Oh, this is our market and you guys are going to suffer and you're going to have to sell that Range Rover," and all that sort of stuff. And I don't drive a Range Rover, by the way, just for the record. I
Isn't
do like
Maserati?
them. I do like them.
Isn't Maserati the new thing?
Yeah,
I was
Yeah.
going to say. It's a Lamborghini SUV.
Yeah.
David, I mean, I guess what's your on that though, with the liking the agent and not liking the agent? I mean, how do you feel about agents actually putting preference to the buyer that they ultimately do like, or the buyer that, maybe it's not that. Obviously, there's a vendor interest, right? But if they can get a vendor around that money and then also sell it to the buyer that they like, or the buyer that they think deserves it the most, how active do you reckon that is in the market, where maybe they go back to them for the final offer, or maybe they, give them access a bit earlier so they can get their ducks lined up versus some other buyers, or, maybe you give them a bit of extra information that really encourages them to make an offer. How do you think that plays out in the market, and how important it is to get the agents on your side? Do you think that there is a benefit there?
I think it's a really, really good question. It raises some very tricky issues. I think a lot of agents will favour buyers that have a property to sell.
Yes.
And I am, and look, to be honest, like what I don't want to come off here is that I'm not perfect, and I've got, we've got it wrong before, and we don't win all of our business. So I don't want to sit here and sound like the white knight of real estate that's going to come out and sort of save everyone. But I think the awareness is really valuable in the market. And if a purchaser walks up to an agent and says, "I really like this property and we own the one around the corner, it might be a semi or whatever it is, and if you help me get this, we'll give you our listing," that is a really tricky thing that happens in the market. And we see a lot of it. And I think it's important for a seller to understand that when their agent's communicating to them who they are, where are they coming from, what, have they sold? If not, are they talking to you about selling their place? It's fine if they are, but I think it's information as a seller that you should have. because you're right, Chris, sometimes processes get accelerated because the agent will go, well, hang on, if I sell it to him, we'll get the one around the
Yeah.
corner. That's two deals. The owner will never know. And I think this is where the prop tech things that you talk about, Veronica, that are coming into the mix. And one will come along, I'm sure, that that disrupts the industry, I'm sure. Like, it just feels like an industry that's ripe for it, to give people full visibility. Yeah, that's the biggest thing I've come up against, where I will often say to a friend who's trying to buy a property, did you make the offer? Yes. Did you put it in writing? Yes. Have you had a response? No. I'm like, send the offer to their solicitor. And they're like, why would I do that? I don't want to annoy anyone. And so you need to make sure that offer gets to the owner. And look, most of the times it does, but once in a while it doesn't. And you've uncovered that this particular agent is shepherding someone. And yeah, I guess they're just things that you sort of need to be aware of.
Can you cut the agent out though? The agent gets a bit pissed off with that though,
Totally.
because
yeah.
and the agent's like, hang on a sec, I was just getting back to you. I was just speaking to the vendor, and then it all feels like you're almost put to the bottom of the pile. Then is that a risky strategy sometimes to play?
Totally risky. And you know what? I think that it is risky because you don't want to disenfranchise that agent. But I mean, if you've made an offer and 3 days later you haven't had a response, either that agent's just lazy or something's not quite right. But look, there are a lot of really, really good agents in the marketplace, and over time you start to see which agents have consistent performance and which ones will be helpful. And it's not a popularity contest. It's like, if you're looking for a particular house and they can help you, then that's great. But yeah, I have new staff that come into this office, and I often say to them, real estate will knock your socks off. You'll see things in property that you just wouldn't believe. And it normally takes 2 weeks before they come up and be like, oh my God, I can't believe that, this happened. Or yeah, the reality show, that's not Lux listings with the guys cruising around in the Bentleys. The real reality show would be very watchable, I think.
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. And you can find out all about what I'm working on at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you'll find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program, access to suburb help for investors, or if you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, you can connect with my team at Good Deeds Property Buyers. And if you'd like a 30% discount plus free postage for my book Auction Ready, How to Buy Property Even Though You're Scared Shitless, and yes, I'm a potty mouth, use the code ELEPHANT at the checkout. veronicamorgan.com.au.
If you're thinking about buying your first home, upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and importantly get the finance right. Please reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Don't forget that you can download our free full or forecaster report. Which experts can you trust to get it right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
It's the conversations that you have in those living rooms. It's the conversations when the auction is passing in. It's the conversations you have when, you've got 3 buyers and you've just got to really, it's all the sort of the story behind it, the lives that you're actually changing, I guess, and the stresses, and why they're selling, and the story with the neighbor and everything like that. That's, I think, the fun of real estate rather than the glitz and glam of the money, I guess. But it's,
it's Chris, it's why I still do it. I mean, I often get asked by friends, like, you've been doing this for 20 years, like, why do you still do it? And even as early as yesterday, I went into a living room and met a woman who'd recently lost a husband, and it had been revealed to her that there were significant financial issues. And I was like, hang on. You don't need to sign up with an agent right now. You need a good financial advisor. You need an accountant. You need like help. And I was driving away from the house thinking, I don't think I'll get that house because I feel like she's told me too much. And I've noticed sometimes in my job that if someone opens up to you too much, you won't get the gig, because they'll go and they'll walk the dog with a friend and they'll be like, oh my God, I can't believe you told the guy that. But the real estate's messy. Like I often say to friends, it's like making sausages, that if you kind of knew what it was like working in a real estate office, you wouldn't do it, because it's dealing with people going through divorce. It's people in debt. It's really messy. It's not Lux listings. Look, it might be for those guys and good on them, but more often than not, I'm going home thinking about dealing with someone who's, just their relationships collapse. We've seen a lot of that this year. I think of the sales that we've made this year, such a huge percentage were from divorce. That it impacted the team. We're dealing with a lot of really, really tricky situations.
It is tough. And I think too, from the trusted advisor perspective of a real estate agent, there's a small cohort of agents who see themselves as trusted advisors. There's also a cohort that think that they're trusted advisors, but they're not. They give the same advice to everyone basically, and they think they're trustworthy, but they just don't even get it, that there's a bigger picture, involved. And, what you're talking about there, about the advising people that, look, actually slow down, don't sell until you've got these other ducks lined up. That's quite holistic advice. And certainly on the buyer's side of the equation, I find that frustrating too, because we will do exactly that same conversation with clients. Don't buy yet. Go and get these things sorted out before you buy. Unfortunately, like you say, they might go for a walk with someone who says, why did you tell them that? Oh, you need to go and talk to someone else and not tell them anything.
Yeah.
But the reality is that people do need to share this stuff. If they can find a trusted advisor, they do need to share those things so that they do get good advice. It's rare to get that when you're not being paid for it, because a sales agent only gets paid when you sell.
Yeah.
At least I can actually, I do property strategy sessions and people might pay for my advice. But in our our sort of sales pitches, if you like, to potential clients, we're not being paid at that point, and we are giving advice often slow down. But then you will get unscrupulous operators who, they don't even think they're unscrupulous. They just think that they've got a job to do and they're quite transactional in their thinking.
Yeah.
And they will swoop in and they'll go, no, you can sell, you can buy.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you can't protect people from that. I'd love to be able to, but you can't, because, human beings, and they will knee-jerk and they will make decisions that aren't necessarily in their best interests. So that must be frustrating. I mean, it's always been frustrating for me. And I've seen business not come our way because we've had a similar approach to you. But I've also seen people come back second time, and I've also seen people refer us where they didn't choose us and wish they had. So I know how that can come back if you do have a long-term view. But I am curious to know, what are some of the things that do frustrate you the most about vendors? Because they will say stuff, won't they? And they will trot out these lines.
Well, I can tell you now, my partner had a baby last week. It was our first child.
Congratulations.
And there is stay with me, but I had to leave the auction to go to the hospital.
Oh, wow.
So it was talk about the reality show. But when I left the auction, I won't put all the numbers in because it'll be too sort of easily identifiable, but the parties were $200,000 apart on a $10 million property. And when I was at the Royal North Shore, I was texting the team saying, is it done? Is it done? Is it done? And it's still not done. So that was a week and a half ago. And what I sometimes see with owners, the reason I tell that story is they become so fixated on a number that their friends might have told them, or an agent might have told them, or I might have told them. I mean, I often say to people, I think it's worth this, but we obviously won't know. But vendors in particular, I think sometimes lose sight of why they're doing what they're doing. And in this instance, they want to retire. They can retire now. And I think anybody who's been through life, you kind of see time is one of those things that it's only important when you realize when something happens. And I often I work with a lot of downsizers and say, guys, like, you don't have to sell, but if you can make this work and you can go and spend time with the grandkids, get on with it. Like, we've just seen the biggest property boom in the last 20 years. Why are you waiting on that? There's that. Vendors that insist people take their shoes off before they come into their house. I find that extremely frustrating, because when you're running an open house and you've got 20 groups coming through, that's 40 shoes plus partners plus friends. So that's not ideal.
Why do people put white carpet down is what I've got to ask. I mean, seriously, what a dumb decision. But no, I agree. It's one of my bugbears, and I always hate it when I wear the wrong boots out on a Saturday open.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing, open houses. It's sort of, you get people that come in and use the bathroom mid-open, and it's just like, there's just things that I often tell my mum stories, and she's like, oh my God, I can't believe this happens. I'm like, it happens all the time. Like, it's just how it goes. But look, to get back to your question, I think like frustrations with vendors, look, normally it's fear, right? Normally there's something going on in the background that is preventing a decision. Indecisiveness is obviously tricky, but again, I get it. Like when I sold my house last year, I got offered the money I wanted. It took me 3/4 of a bottle of wine and a long walk to accept the offer. And it was confronting how difficult it was. So I think that, it's so easy. Like I'm working on this deal I just mentioned to you before, and my team are saying to me this morning, we any closer? I'm like, we're 50 grand closer, but we're still miles apart. But people are people, they'll make decisions. Those people will always sell with me. It might take another 3 months, but we'll get there. But yeah, I think price is probably the main thing, where I think people say, I got a valuation for 4.5 million from the bank last year. That's the number. And you sit with them and think and say, look, you've just had 7,000 people through the place. Like it's 4.1, but that'd probably be, or the other thing that I know Bindi would say, she's not here, who works with me on every file, vendors that won't make any effort to get the property ready for market, is madness. It's madness. Most buyers have 15 to 20 minutes in your house, and then they're forced to make a major decision. If you don't put the time and energy into presenting your property, you are costing yourself money. And we see it. We see it often where people go, it's too hard. It comes back in droves.
Especially these days. When I first started in real estate, like only the very special properties were styled, but now everything, you style a 1-bedroom apartment, like 100%. You practically style for rental now. So actually you probably don't have to for rental anymore, but.
It's funny you say that, because it is funny you say that, because we realised something in the office a couple of weeks ago, that the sale properties that we sell that were styled, and then the marketing that we use from those said sale properties, always lease like that. Straight away.
Yeah.
And so our rental department's kind of like, well, how do we get around it? And virtual styling is not popular because it's kind of weird.
It does look weird.
Yeah. But I do think that people not investing a little bit of money into the presentation of the house, that's frustrating, because you can see them losing money.
Yeah. The whole anchoring to a price, happened this morning with a client. It's a frustrating thing. He came to me like 3-4 years ago. It was an apartment somewhere in Sydney, high density. After he purchased it, I was like, I could see the writing on the wall. I knew there was a lot more developments coming. And it's just been a year, maybe 18 months, trying to get them to upgrade. Little baby, and it's tight, right? If they sell it at this price, they're only going to get this much cash because it hasn't gone up. It's actually gone down in value over 4 years, even now he's making offers, and it's like 15 grand difference, 2% difference to the sale price potentially. But it's so fixated to that number, and it's like re-educating on what's the opportunity cost here? What's the benefit are you trying to sell? What are you going to achieve? And I think it's so hard to shift your brain from the pain of life not working out, or the situation not being what you want it to be, to what it could become in the future, and taking people on that journey. David, as someone probably in one of the most competitive markets in the country, got to throw a bit of a curveball towards Veronica here. What's your thoughts on the sort of the buyer's agents and the evolution of that industry, and the pros and cons, and how to get the best result from a buyer's agent for someone who would have been dealing with them for a long, long time?
I'm really surprised how prevalent buyer's agents have become. I think earlier in my career, I thought, this won't catch on. And again, I think the benefit of time, it's now a thing. I think we did a calculation that about 20% of the transactions now that we do in our market involved, or there's a buyer's agent involved. So they're here to stay. I've used a buyer's agent to buy an investment property in Queensland. I think that added a lot of value because I didn't know the market, and he did, and he was referred to me, and I trusted him, and it was a good experience. I think if you're fairly commercial and you've got the time, you don't need a buyer's agent. That's my genuine feel, because I think that the real estate and domain.com is where most of the market is. Most off-market stuff's overpriced. I'm sorry, folks, I hate to say that, but the whole off-market thing, in my experience, is someone that's too afraid to put a sign out the front because they think the neighbours will laugh at them. So the buyer's agents often pitch this, I can get you the house that no one else knows about. Well, the best houses are always, well, mainly, not always, but mainly do appear on market. So if you've got the time and you can find your own property, I think you don't need a buyer's agent. If you are time poor, and you are happy to pay for the service, there's value because it's someone on the ground. But I think people, again, need to be very mindful of the fact some buyers agents don't even work Saturdays. They don't come to our Saturday opens. So oh, no, I don't work Saturdays. That's why I got out of being an agent, because it's too hard. So like if you're paying someone 2% on a purchase and they're not even going to the Saturday opens, like what planet? Anyway, that's a whole another thing. But yeah, look, my view is that there's a small percentage of people that really would benefit from having a buyer's agent. I think there's a fairly high percentage of people that would benefit from having someone to bid on their behalf at an auction. Because if you don't know auctions and the first time you attend an auction, you're one of the registered parties, you are vulnerable. You're going into a very stressful situation. I bid all the time on behalf of clients. I've been doing this for half my life. I still get super, super anxious before an auction, and it's not even my money. Like I'm walking up the driveway going, oh, and like it's a very, very sort of stressful process. So I would say to people out there that, should you use a buyer's agent? If you've got time to look, probably not. If you don't know what you're doing at an auction, you should definitely pay someone to go and bid on your behalf, or at least stand next to you, because you will make decisions on the auction floor that you wouldn't have thought that you would make. It's very, very overwhelming.
Before I sort of cut in there, which I will, of course, question for you, David. Do you believe that every property is a good property as long as it's at the right price?
No.
Oh, that's good. That's good, yes.
I feel like I'm in trouble here. I feel like I'm...
No, you're not. Interestingly, what you've done for me...
I'm just going to sit back here with a...
No. Veronica's just opened a buyer's agent's business.
No. I'm not gonna defend the use of buyer's agents per se, mainly because I think what you've done, you've described your experience of the buyer's agents you've worked with.
Yeah.
And what you've actually described to me is a sad indictment on the buyer's agents particularly in the lower North Shore anyway, because if the only pitch from them is the off markets, which you've said is mostly overpriced crap that basically wouldn't really cut it on the open market, and I totally agree. I think that's just a very lame and obvious pitch for someone in terms of, a value add. Yeah. The real value add, and then bidding at auction, sure, that's sort of overcoming the fear of the stress of a very pressure situation where you're outmatched. You don't really know what you don't know what you're doing because you're unfamiliar with that environment, and it's high sums of money. But one of the things that you said earlier, which I wanted to pick up with, and you said you're scared sometimes, I think you used that word, about the amount of power a sales agent has at times. And you're the conduit between the buyer and the seller. And unfortunately, in my view, most buyer's agents aren't up to the task of actually meeting you and fulfilling, I guess, bridging that gap between the power you have and the lack of power that the buyer has. That's where a really good buyer's agent makes their money. That's where they're worth it, because they basically can interpret all that stuff that all that power that you have. They're like the whisperer. But there's very few with that level of skill. Yeah. Right? And quite frankly, I've been surveying buyer's agents because I've launched a mentoring program. So this is perfect because the reason I've done so is because there's a real shortage of skills out there in buyer's agency, because you can go and do a license course. Yeah. And, until recently in New South Wales, anyway, kids set up business as a buyer's agency without actually learning one thing about being a buyer's agent. And you've learned how to sell property. You've learned how to put a property on through property management, but you haven't actually learned how to be a buyer's agent. So I guess as a sales agent, your insights there are really telling to me about really the caliber of buyer's agent out there. And I would agree with you that if that's all you're dealing with, that's what you're seeing out there in the marketplace, then buyers, if they've got the time and the energy and the inclination, would be better off not using one.
Totally. Look, you touch on a really good point. I think in real estate, on both sides of the coin, being real estate selling agents and buyers agents, the available training in the industry is pretty woeful. Most of it's about getting new business.
Yes.
It's not about execution. And you're right about. I should make the comment. There are some very good buyers agents because they know how to read what the agent's doing. They really can play the game. It's actually a bit sad to me that they are in some ways necessary in a landscape where it's like vendor advocacy. Isn't it a shame that there needs to be a business to help people to choose someone in business? But the training element is, whenever I've gone to conferences in the past, most of the time it's about how to win new business, how to manage 10 campaigns, how to sell more advertising. It's not like how to negotiate when you're stuck between a Scottish owner and a Chinese purchaser, which is the deal I just described before. Very challenging. But the actual craft of being a buyer's agent, I haven't seen anywhere where that's taught.
I've literally just finished a pilot program because it isn't taught anywhere.
Yeah.
So,
Well, selling agents should look out, because I can tell you it's not just buyer's agents. A lot of selling agents couldn't negotiate their way out of a corner.
Yeah.
And they think it's all just price. They won't look at terms. Like you get a well-educated person that comes into real estate that understands negotiation and understands communication and expectations management in the right way. They just run rings around a lot of the people that are in the industry.
Yeah,
David,
as long as they can.
Trying a different. So you go, Veronica.
No, I was about to say, as long as they can divorce themselves, because I mean, when you're a buyer, it's your money and there's emotion involved. Even if you're an investor, a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm not emotional about the purchase," but sometimes fear drives that lack of emotion or the perceived lack of, or attempted lack of emotion. And so there's always emotion involved to a degree. And I know myself, I'm an expert, right? I live and breathe this stuff. When I'm buying a property, it's extraordinarily stressful because it's my money, you know, and I treat other people's money with utmost respect. But it's still, I don't have the emotional tie to their money that I have to my own. And I've made mistakes when I've left it to myself, with my money and my ultra caution with my own money. And I should have thrown caution to the wind on a cup. I should not have ever thrown caution to the wind. But there's two deals I know now that I will live forever regretting not buying those two properties, and I could have bought them,
Yeah, we all have those. We all have those. I drive past many houses that I wish I'd bought, and I'm like, oh gosh.
So, David, you've made a active choice not to go and license. I'm sure you've been hunted and by Bell, by McGrath, by LJ, by Rain and Horn, etc. And you've made an active decision to not go down a franchise model or become part of a big group. What sort of drove in your, I guess, resilience to stay independent as a boutique? Because in the real estate agent, it's so prolific, right? Like it's almost like people are hunting each other and it's all about the franchise. But there's very few boutique players that sort of hold their ground. What's the reason for that, and why I guess you're passionate about it? Because you have to be to stick around.
Yeah, look, it's funny. I mean, in weaker moments, again, if I've had a couple of glasses of wine, I'll often say to friends, had I gone and joined McGrath 12 years ago, we'd be all sitting out in the back of my boat, blah, blah, blah. Because, I think the reality is that particularly during the boom when it was at full steam, the major franchises did amazingly well. And a lot of their top agents were very, very good agents. And they really revolutionized the business. I mean, I think credit to John McGrath where it was due. At the time, real estate was very archaic, and that business came along and lifted the bar, and it did. But then it went, obviously on its own journey. I nearly went and worked with them way back when, and I think the thing that made me nervous was the lack of flexibility, like sitting in front of a client that, maybe doesn't need to sell, but will sell if they get a certain number. But, you don't have to rope them up into a $20,000 auction campaign. A lot of those franchise models are very, there's a prescribed formula. And to be honest, I can't sit in front of someone and say, I reckon you should do this, when I kind of know deep down you shouldn't. And I always found that quite challenging. We've only had a bit of interest from I think the newsletter has probably kept a lot of the franchises at bay because I don't really want a fox in their hen house. But I think, look, being independent enables us, like we own the building that we're in. I've got a team of really good people. They've all got families. We love sales. It's the best. Like when deals are on and you can put them together, it's great. But I think being out of that high pressured sales formula allows you to be a little bit more human.
Yep.
And to be honest with you, like I don't want to, again, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to sound like the angel of real estate. I just don't, like, if you live and work in an area, it's nice to be able to bump into people and they go, yeah, he was good to work with. We made a mistake. We should have taken his advice. We didn't. But I think franchises can be quite limited. And I think that's why now you see the rise of models like the agency, which has agents being able to work with a little bit more of their own sort of independence within that model. But for us, I mean, we sort of love where we are. We have Halloween at the office, Christmas at the office. The newsletter wouldn't get past, I'm sure, the editing suites of Bell and McGrath. So yeah, but I don't know, Chris. Maybe one day if they come in and the helicopter over the top with the box of cash and they say we're gonna drive you out of town, then we'll talk. But I think independence is just enables us to be, completely independent of the whole franchise model.
It sounds a little like independence really suits your personality. Like, you do see these things, you do have a certain turn of phrase, and you do have despite the fact you've been, well and truly indoctrinated in the industry, you've been in it since 25 years, like you haven't had a career outside of this industry, but you still do appear to have a perception of it or a view of it that is less... it's more, it's more 360 degree. You know what I mean? You're not totally immersed in it. You can't see it the way outsiders would see it. And I think that's what makes your newsletter quite refreshing because, I've been in it 22 years as well, but I mean, I was 30, I'm not giving away I was in my very early 30s when I got into property. I was 17 when I got into property. So I had some other perspective, but even so in my early years, I remember, rabbiting out and regurgitating the stuff that my colleagues were saying and I was learning and my friends from outside the industry were mocking me. And I'm like, that's healthy to be mocked when you say, in the end of the day, the agent, the market will determine the price, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. All that stuff.
I mean, look, I love the industry, and Chris touched on it before about the story. I probably, hopefully, will get to a point where I can write a book, and the one thing I love about the job that I have is access to people. I've worked for Supreme Court judges. I've done, I didn't have a formal education. My father died when I was quite young, and I left school and went into real estate kind of because I had to. Like, I kind of needed a job that could pay pretty well, and so it was at the time a bit of a I'll give this a crack, and so it wasn't a destiny path. But I think that working with people when they're vulnerable, and it sounds cheesy, but there's something really cool about working with people when, like, change is awful. And I think if you've bought and sold yourselves, you know what it's like. It's just, it's not fun. But some of my best friends are former clients, and they weren't good mates when we started out. Like, one is a barrister, and he always tells the story about when we met, and he goes, oh, this bloke, he was all swagger and all this. And then over the sale of his home, we really connected and just became good mates, and recently did a trek together. So I'd say to people thinking about getting into real estate that there's huge opportunity to come into the business and do well, and you can be yourself, and you don't have to be a high pressure parrot. But you can't come in and do it in a year. Like, it takes time.
It takes a long time to dislodge the dogs, to get rid of the top dogs selling 90% of the properties. But absolutely, I mean, same for here. I mean, every time I meet a client, it's a bit more fun for me. I do a lot of purchases, right? Which is, it's more about forward thinking. Let's make this happen. And you're probably dealing a lot more on the sales side when things are happening that are forcing them to sell, or, it's a transition period. So it's different end of the journey. So Dave, you got in that vein, a property Dumbo for us, a story that we can all learn from.
Yeah, so I thought about this, and I actually talked to my colleagues, and probably the best example I can give you is, this is from the buyer's side, a property Dumbo from the buyer's side. But we were selling a house for a lady who was in her early 90s, and she'd been raised in this house. and she appointed us to sell it. We put it on the market. We had 2 purchasers that wanted to buy it. One was an investment banker. One was a local mum with a couple of kids, and we got into a very competitive pre-auction bidding situation. The investment banker, on paper, had a lot of tactical sort of prowess about negotiating, and he put an offer on the table that I'm sure you guys have heard the terms exploding bids. Like, he put an offer on the table that blew up at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Otherwise, he was walking away. And Joy, our vendor, Joy, who's like this beautiful, beautiful older woman, all she cared about when I was selling the house was that her cat didn't get outside. And we had that purchaser, and then we had the other purchaser who offered $100,000 less, but happened to bump into Joy on the street. And when I went down and sat down with her and said, "Here it is. These are the offers." She looked at me and she said, I don't want to sell to him. I want to sell to the lady I met with the 2 little kids. And I said, "No, that's madness. I'll be in trouble. Like, I can't sell the property for less." And she said, no, I'll ring my solicitor. I'll let him know. You've told me everything, but I'm not selling to him. And I actually rang, I hope I don't get into trouble for this, but I rang the purchaser and was like, "Mate, you need to like back down. You need to unexplode your bid. You need to take a very different sort of angle here because it's not going your way." The property sold to the other party. So I think the key learning for me, or for the Dumbo thing, is that you get more bees with honey. It plays to be smart and not be heroic. And I think particularly when you're buying someone's home, you're buying their story. And how that trickles down to them often, makes a big difference to how it's perceived. So, yeah, that'd be my major.
I've got one in a very similar vein. A client of ours, a very close client of ours. The owner was pretending she was a cleaner.
Right.
Wow.
So they were buying the property, and she sort of bumped into them pretending to be a cleaner, and she judged who she was going to sell it on and how they dealt with her. And the client was really nice and respectful and honoured their presence, and was, smiley and things like that. She was dressed as a cleaner, had the stuff and everything. It was the owner. And generally when the agent sold the property, they said, "Look," she said, "I want to sell it to these guys as long as they're around the money." And then they made an offer, and she thought the offer was fair, and she accepted it. And then it was chaos for the agent. The person was offering more, way more, give them 150 grand more, etc. And then the vendor just held their price and just went ahead with the deal my client offered. And so, absolutely. People can, sometimes vendors obviously just care about the price, but they wrote a letter in that situation as well, explaining like, this is our situation, because they had a feeling that the owner might value that stuff just because of the culture. And so, sometimes it's not all about the money. It's the experience the vendor really wants out of the situation.
But who makes an exploding offer to a 92-year-old woman and says, "If you don't take it, I'm walking away"? Like, she was like, "Mate, I've been here since both wars." Like, it's kind of like,
it's probably, I couldn't spend the $100,000.
Well, this is the thing. I caught up with her after the sale went through, and she'd bought like a Dyson, and she'd bought like this new grill, and she was like minted, because the house had sold for this huge price, and she'd never had all this cash. But I think the key learning in that is that men in particular, when they're negotiating, often sort of use aggression as an attempted tool, and often it does not work.
It's an interesting one. And, it's funny because sometimes, our clients will say, aren't you going to put a deadline on the offer? I'm like, the deadline has to have some meaning.
Yeah.
I put a deadline on the offer at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because you need to have that extra hour to go to the bank to get the money transferred so you can transfer the deposit. There's meaning behind that, but just threatening and posturing. And I have to confess, we've tried all that. I've been in this business long enough to have tried all those things, those tactics. And then it's like, they don't work. They just get people offside. And, if you lose the purchase because you've been dick swinging, or trying to, it's like I've seen people at auction, wait till the very last minute. They're just holding out. Hammer falls, then they bid. Imagine that conversation on the way home.
I bought a little house up the coast. I bought a little house up the coast a few years ago, and when I drove past, the sign was falling down, and I rang the agent and I said, mate, and so this is me, and I rang him and said, did it go to auction? He said, yeah, it went to auction about 2 months ago. And I said, what did it pass in at? And he's like, 800,000. Like, yeah, okay, well, we'll offer you 650. And he said, look, I'm just going to be honest with you. If you want to buy this property, you're going to have to pay the ask. And for the next 4 weeks, I rang him every day, let him have it, deadline the offer, and bid myself up. And we bought it for 800,000.
Let's go. Well done.
And that agent, to this day, I always joke to him, I'm like, you played me like a fiddle, because he didn't let his ego get into it. And I would bring him and go, they're crazy. He's like, if you want the house, this is the price. And,
I love it.
You know, in the end, we paid it. So, yeah.
God. Well, on that note, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you
Pleasure.
so much.
Thanks for having me on.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.